The lights flicker once, then die completely. In the absolute darkness, 354 feet beneath the Barents Sea, you can hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. A sound that shouldn't exist inside a nuclear submarine. The air tastes metallic, thick with smoke, and the bitter tang of leaked chemicals. You're Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, and you're writing what you know will be your final letter. Around you, 22 other sailors huddle in the rear compartments of the Kursk, Russia's most advanced nuclear submarine. The forward sections, where your friends lived and worked just hours ago, are flooded tombs filled with seawater and twisted metal. Outside, 354 feet above your head, rescue ships circle helplessly on the surface. They can hear you tapping on the hull with wrenches and hammers, desperate Morse code messages that spell out the same thing over and over. We are here. We are alive. Please help us. But help isn't coming fast enough. The air is running out. The cold is seeping through the steel walls. And you're beginning to understand that the pride of the Russian Northern Fleet has become your coffin beneath the Arctic waters. August 12th, 2000. The Cold War was officially over, but beneath the frigid waters of the Barents Sea, old rivalries still played out in deadly games of nuclear hide-and-seek. The Russian Northern Fleet was conducting its largest naval exercise in years, a demonstration of power meant to prove that despite economic collapse and military budget cuts, Russia remained a formidable naval force. At the center of this display was the Kursk, designation K-141, an Oscar II-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine. She was a monster of Cold War engineering, 508 feet long, displacing 24,000 tons when submerged, and armed with enough nuclear-tipped torpedoes and cruise missiles to sink an entire carrier battle group. The submarine represented everything the Soviet Union had poured into its naval ambitions. Her double-hull titanium construction could theoretically survive direct torpedo hits. Her nuclear reactor could keep her submerged for months. Her crew of 118 officers and sailors were among the elite of the Russian Navy, men who had trained for years to operate the most sophisticated weapons platform in the fleet. Kursk's captain, Captain First Rank Gennady Lyakhin, was a veteran submariner with over 20 years of experience. His crew trusted him completely. At 45, he represented the old guard of Soviet naval officers, professionals who took pride in their service despite the chaos surrounding the Russian military in the post-Soviet era. The exercise, codenamed Summer X, was designed to test the Northern Fleet's ability to engage NATO forces in wartime scenarios. Kursk was assigned to attack the battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky using practice torpedoes. Weapons that carried no explosive warheads but were otherwise identical to combat versions. What the crew didn't know was that Russia's economic crisis had forced dangerous corners to be cut. Maintenance schedules had been delayed, safety inspections were rushed. Most critically, some of the practice torpedoes they were loading had been manufactured using experimental propellant that had never been properly tested under combat conditions. On the morning of August 12th, as Kursk prepared to dive for her attack run, everything seemed routine. The submarine's sophisticated sonar systems painted a clear picture of the exercise area. Her nuclear reactor hummed with reliable power. Her crew moved through pre-dive checklists with practiced precision. None of them realized they were about to become victims of the very weapons they trusted with their lives. Life aboard a nuclear submarine is like living inside a steel tube, suspended in an alien environment where the slightest mistake can kill everyone aboard. The Kursk was divided into 10 watertight compartments, each serving specific functions that kept the boat operational and her crew alive beneath hundreds of feet of crushing seawater. The forward torpedo room, where the disaster began, was a cramped space dominated by massive torpedo tubes and storage racks. 24 weapons filled the compartment, 65 to 76 torpedoes capable of sinking aircraft carriers, and practice versions for training exercises. The torpedo crew worked in constant proximity to enough explosive power to level a city block. Loading a torpedo required precise choreography. Each weapon weighed over 4 tons and measured 21 feet in length. Hydraulic systems moved them from storage racks to firing tubes, but human hands guided every step. The slightest damage to a torpedo's fuel system could turn it from a weapon into a bomb. Senior torpedo officer Captain Lieutenant Sergei Lyubushkin supervised every loading operation. His men had performed this routine hundreds of times, but complacency was the enemy. Each torpedo contained hydrogen peroxide fuel that could explode if contaminated or overheated. The practice torpedoes used an experimental fuel called HTP, high-test peroxide, that was supposed to be safer than combat versions. The crew quarters were Spartan even by military standards. Officers shared small cabins with fold-down bunks stacked 3 high. Enlisted men slept in compartments that doubled as working spaces during the day. Privacy was non-existent. Personal space was measured in inches. The submarine's nuclear reactor, housed in the 5th compartment, was both salvation and potential death sentence. It provided unlimited underwater endurance, but a reactor accident could irradiate the entire crew within minutes. Reactor specialists like Senior Lieutenant Rashid Aryapov worked in an environment where radiation exposure was carefully monitored but never completely eliminated. Communication with the outside world was severely limited when submerged. Radio waves don't penetrate seawater effectively, so submarines relied on extremely low-frequency transmissions or had to surface to make contact. This isolation was psychological torture during emergencies. You could be dying just miles from help, but unable to call for rescue. The submarine's atmosphere was artificially maintained by complex life support systems. Oxygen was generated through electrolysis of seawater. Carbon dioxide was scrubbed from the air using chemical filters. Temperature and humidity were controlled by massive air conditioning systems. If any of these systems failed, the crew would suffocate in their steel prison. Submarine warfare demanded absolute trust between crew members. A single panicked sailor could doom everyone aboard. Men were psychologically screened for claustrophobia, but the real test came during emergencies when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The Kursk's crew understood these risks, but they also took pride in mastering one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. They were elite specialists operating at the cutting edge of naval technology. The submarine was their weapon, their home, and potentially their tomb, all rolled into one massive steel cylinder sliding silently through the dark waters of the Arctic Ocean. The most immediate danger aboard any submarine is fire. In the confined space of a steel hull, fire consumes oxygen and produces toxic smoke faster than crew can react. Submarine fires burn differently than surface fires. The lack of natural ventilation means smoke and heat build up rapidly in enclosed compartments. Within minutes, smoke can make entire sections uninhabitable. Kursk carried multiple fire suppression systems, but they were double-edged swords. Halon gas could extinguish fires instantly, but would also suffocate anyone trapped in the affected compartment. Carbon dioxide flooding systems worked similarly. They saved the submarine, but potentially killed the crew trying to fight the fire. Flooding was equally terrifying. The ocean pressed against Kursk's hull with crushing force, over 150 pounds per square inch at operational depth. A rupture in the pressure hull would send seawater blasting through the submarine like a fire hose. Steel bulkheads designed to stop torpedoes could be overwhelmed by simple physics if enough water entered the boat. The submarine's ballast tank system allowed controlled diving and surfacing, but battle damage could trap the boat on the bottom. If the ballast tanks couldn't be blown, Kursk would become a steel coffin resting on the seafloor. Emergency ballast systems existed, but they required electrical power that might not be available during disasters. Reactor accidents represented the ultimate nightmare. Kursk's nuclear plant contained enough radioactive material to contaminate hundreds of square miles if it melted down. Reactor compartment flooding could cause a steam explosion that would split the submarine in half. Even minor reactor leaks could irradiate the crew slowly, causing radiation sickness that would kill them over days or weeks. But the most insidious threat came from the weapons themselves. The torpedoes Kursk carried were essentially controlled explosions waiting to happen. Each torpedo contained hundreds of pounds of explosive warheads and volatile fuel. The practice torpedoes used hydrogen peroxide propellant that was notoriously unstable. Russian submarine crews called it devil's fuel because of its tendency to explode without warning. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov knew these dangers intimately. As a member of the submarine's damage control team, he had trained extensively in emergency procedures. But training scenarios couldn't replicate the psychological terror of real disasters. When men were dying around you and the submarine was flooding, textbook procedures became secondary to raw survival instinct. The crew's greatest fear was progressive flooding, water entering multiple compartments faster than damage control teams could contain it. Kursk's watertight bulkheads were designed to isolate damaged sections, but they also trapped crew members on the wrong side of sealed doors. Men could drown just feet away from their shipmates, separated by steel barriers that couldn't be opened without flooding additional compartments. Atmospheric contamination was another silent killer. Submarine air recycling systems filtered out carbon dioxide and generated fresh oxygen, but they couldn't handle massive chemical contamination. Burning plastics, leaked hydraulic fluid, and toxic gases from damaged equipment could poison the entire crew slowly. Gas masks provided limited protection, but they were useless if the contamination source couldn't be eliminated. The submarine's depth worked against survival in multiple ways. At 354 feet beneath the surface, water pressure made individual escape impossible. Even if sailors could reach escape hatches, they would die from decompression before reaching the surface. Emergency breathing apparatus provided only minutes of protection, nowhere near enough time to ascend from operational depth. Rescue operations were complicated by international politics and technological limitations. Russian rescue submarines were outdated and poorly maintained. Western nations possessed more advanced deep-sea rescue systems, but Cold War paranoia made cooperation difficult. Submarine crews often died not from their initial emergency, but from the time it took to organize effective rescue operations. The psychological pressure was crushing. Submarine crews lived with the knowledge that rescue might be impossible even if their distress calls were heard. Surface ships could abandon ship and float in life rafts. Aircraft crews could parachute to safety. Submarine crews could only hope their steel hull would protect them until help arrived. On August 12, 2000, all of these theoretical threats became deadly reality for the 118 men aboard Kursk. What began as a routine torpedo exercise became a catastrophic chain reaction that would test every emergency system and survival procedure the submarine possessed. The crew's training, courage, and dedication would be pushed beyond all limits as they fought for their lives in the crushing darkness of the Arctic Ocean floor. At 11:28 a.m. on August 12, 2000, hell erupted inside Kursk's torpedo room. The explosion started with a single practice torpedo loaded in tube number 4. The weapon's experimental hydrogen peroxide fuel had been leaking slowly, creating a chemical reaction that raised the torpedo's internal temperature to critical levels. Senior torpedo officer Lyubushkin was inspecting the tube when the fuel reached its flashpoint. The blast was instantaneous and devastating. The torpedo exploded with the force of 220 pounds of TNT, instantly killing everyone in the forward compartment. The explosion ripped through steel bulkheads like paper, sending a shockwave through the submarine's hull that could be felt 200 miles away. Norwegian seismic stations recorded the blast as a magnitude 1.5 earthquake. But the first explosion was just the beginning. The blast ruptured fuel lines and damaged 7 additional torpedoes stored in the forward compartment. Fires erupted throughout the torpedo room as leaked fuel ignited. Within seconds, the temperature soared above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum and ignite steel. In the submarine's central command post, Captain Lyachin felt the deck plates buckle beneath his feet. Emergency alarms screamed throughout the boat. The lights flickered as electrical systems failed. Through the internal communication system, he could hear men screaming in the forward compartments. "Fire in compartment 1! Fire in compartment 1! All hands to emergency stations!" The damage control team raced forward, but the heat and smoke were overwhelming. Breathing apparatus provided only limited protection against the toxic gases pouring from burning plastics and leaked chemicals. Men collapsed from smoke inhalation within minutes of entering the affected areas. At 11:30 a.m., just 2 minutes after the initial blast, the situation became catastrophic. The fires in the torpedo room triggered a second massive explosion as the remaining practice torpedoes detonated simultaneously. This blast was recorded by seismic stations as magnitude 3.5, equivalent to several tons of TNT exploding inside the submarine's hull. The explosion blew a hole in Kursk's forward pressure hull large enough to drive a truck through. Seawater blasted into the submarine with the force of a tidal wave, flooding the first 3 compartments in seconds. The massive weight of incoming water drove the submarine's nose down toward the seafloor. Senior Lieutenant Kolesnikov was in the 4th compartment when the second explosion hit. The blast threw him against a steel bulkhead with bone-crushing force. Around him, men were screaming as the submarine's lights failed completely. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows on smoke-filled passageways. The submarine's ballast control systems were destroyed in the explosions. Without the ability to blow ballast tanks, Kursk plummeted toward the bottom like a massive steel stone. Her reinforced hull was designed to withstand combat damage, but not the catastrophic flooding now consuming her forward sections. Kursk struck the seafloor at 11:32 a.m., her bow crashing into the sandy bottom with tremendous force. The impact crushed the already damaged forward compartments and sent another shockwave through the remaining hull sections. Men were thrown around like rag dolls as the submarine settled into her final resting place. In the rear compartments, 23 survivors found themselves trapped in a steel tomb 354 feet beneath the surface. The submarine's nuclear reactor had automatically shut down during the emergency, leaving them in darkness except for battery-powered emergency lights that would last only hours. Kolesnikov and his fellow survivors conducted a quick head count. Most of the submarine's senior officers were dead, killed in the initial explosions. The survivors were primarily junior sailors and technicians who had been working in the rear sections when disaster struck. The situation was desperate beyond words. The forward 2/3 of the submarine were completely flooded and uninhabitable. The remaining compartments were intact but completely isolated from the surface. Their emergency air supply would last perhaps 12 hours under ideal conditions, less if they exerted themselves or if the air purification systems failed. Worse still, they had no way to signal their exact condition to rescue forces. The submarine's main communication systems were destroyed. They could tap on the hull using wrenches and hammers, but Morse code messages couldn't convey the complexity of their situation. As the reality of their predicament sank in, the survivors began to understand they were facing a slow death by suffocation unless rescue arrived within hours. The pride of the Russian Navy had become their prison, and time was running out with each breath they took. The 23 survivors trapped in Kursk's rear compartments faced an agonizing wait for rescue that would stretch far longer than their air supply could sustain them. Senior Lieutenant Kolesnikov became the informal leader of the survivors. Using a pencil and notebook, he began documenting their situation in what he knew might be the submarine's final log entries. His handwriting remained steady despite the deteriorating conditions. It's 13:15. All personnel from compartment 6, 7, 8 are located in the 9th compartment. There are 23 people here. We made this decision because of accident. None of us can get to the surface. The survivors attempted to extend their air supply by using emergency oxygen canisters and carbon dioxide scrubbers, but the submarine's life support systems were designed for surface operations, not prolonged survival on the seafloor. The air grew steadily more toxic as carbon dioxide levels increased and oxygen was consumed. As hours passed, the cold began affecting everyone. The submarine's heating systems were offline, and the Arctic seawater surrounding the hull conducted heat away from the interior compartments. Men huddled together for warmth, but hypothermia was inevitable in the unheated steel chambers. On the surface, Russian rescue ships had arrived within hours of the disaster, but their equipment was woefully inadequate for deep-sea rescue operations. The Russian Navy's deep submergence rescue vehicles were outdated and poorly maintained. Initial rescue attempts failed when the rescue submarine Priz couldn't properly mate with Kursk's escape hatch. International offers of assistance were initially rejected by Russian officials who feared exposing naval secrets to foreign powers. British and Norwegian rescue teams with advanced equipment waited for permission that came too late. Political pride and Cold War paranoia prevented effective rescue operations during the critical first days. By August 14th, 2 days after the disaster, toxic gases from emergency oxygen generators had poisoned the remaining air in the survivors' compartment. Kolesnikov's final note, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, documented their last hours. "I am writing blindly. It seems like there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope that someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel from the compartments who are now in the 9th and will attempt to get out." The last survivors died on August 15th, more than 3 days after the initial explosion. When Norwegian divers finally entered the submarine on August 21st, they found 23 bodies in the 9th compartment, along with Kolesnikov's notes and personal letters written in the final hours. The disaster exposed massive deficiencies in the Russian Navy's safety procedures and rescue capabilities. Investigations revealed that the practice torpedoes used outdated, unstable fuel that had been banned by other navies years earlier. Maintenance records had been falsified to hide equipment problems caused by budget cuts. President Vladimir Putin faced his first major crisis as Russia's new leader. His initially slow response to the disaster and rejection of foreign assistance damaged his reputation and highlighted the gap between Russian military ambitions and actual capabilities. The Kursk was eventually raised in 2001, but not before becoming a symbol of post-Soviet military decline and the human cost of political pride over practical rescue operations. Today, a memorial stands in Murmansk where the names of all 118 Kursk crew members are etched in black granite. Visitors often leave flowers and small bottles of vodka, a traditional Russian tribute to fallen sailors. The memorial's inscription reads simply, "To those who died in the service of the fatherland." But perhaps the most haunting memorial lies in a Moscow archive, where Dmitry Kolesnikov's final letters to his wife are preserved behind glass. Written in the dying submarine's darkness, his words transcend the politics and failures that led to the disaster. "I love you. Don't suffer too much. My regards to GV, regards to my family. Mitya." The Kursk disaster changed submarine safety protocols worldwide, but it couldn't bring back the 118 men who died in the Arctic darkness. Their story serves as a reminder that beneath the ocean's surface, courage and technology mean nothing if pride prevents nations from accepting help when their sailors need it most. Some tragedies teach lessons, others simply break hearts. The Kursk did both, one last breath at a time.